We're going to have a really interesting day. We're going to kick things off this morning, with a conversation that I think is going to be very relevant, but also stimulating and thought-provoking, and hopefully I think is going to engage a lot of you in thinking about the places that you come from and your lines of work, because basically what we're talking about is narratives and stories. And when we think about issues of economic inclusion and we think about places, and certainly this is true of Detroit, the questions of narratives and who owns those narratives and who owns the stories and what are the perceptions that are out there is a huge part of addressing many of the issues that we've been discussing over the past yesterday, and then we'll continue to discuss today. So we thought that it would be great, actually, if we started off with a panel of folks who represent the media in different fashions, and we will allow them each to introduce themselves. But these are people who range a spectrum from bloggers that if you work in sort of the urban economic development space that you might be very familiar with these folks, to a radio host here from WDET, to local newspaper representatives. So just going down the line, we have our moderator is going to be Aaron Wren, and I see they've mixed themselves up. Aaron, you might know as he runs a blog called the Urbanophile, which probably many of you are familiar with, but here he's also representing the Manhattan Institute, and so I think is indicative of the many hats that media professionals can wear and the evolving role of a journalist, if you will. Here, out of order, is John Schmidt from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and I let him talk about his extensive body of work. To the right, I'm left-handed, so I never know which is my right. That's the thing, I'm allowed to not know my right or left. But to his right is Dustin Walsh from Crain's Detroit Business. And then we have Pete Saunders, who is here representing as an urban affairs reporter for Forbes, and also has his own blog that I'll let him tell you about. And finally, Jerome Vaughn.
My brother, Dustin.
Jerome Vaughn, who is the news director and host of All Things Considered for WDET here in Detroit. And so we have a broad spectrum of perspectives, geographically, professionally, personally, and I look forward to a lively conversation. So Aaron, can I hand it over to you?
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for coming out. And I just wanted to start off, since all of us who are in the media business love to talk about what we're writing about or what stories we're working on, I just wanted to give everybody an opportunity to do that and get a flavor for the kinds of stories and the kinds of things that we are looking to cover. So maybe, John, you could lead us off by taking a little bit of time, maybe 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes, looking at, maybe what's a story that you just worked on or you are working on, and some of what you do in your role at the Journal-Sentinel.
Yeah, gladly. I had my formative years starting in Chicago as a reporter, but then I had this opportunity to go abroad, and I went to Germany right after the Berlin Wall fell. And then you had economic change, economic Darwinism moving very fast. And I started, in terms of what stories I like, I started liking stories about globalization and economic change and that big intersection of our lives, our livelihoods, our hopes, our aspirations, and what other people call economic writing. And what many people take as economic writing and diminish into something actually dry about interest rates or exchange rates. Or, fortunately, the Federal Reserve has departments that make it much more interesting than just interest rates. Jerry. Milwaukee and Wisconsin are an excellent opportunity to look at economic change. Milwaukee, you're in Detroit, you might as well be in Milwaukee, really. Demographically, in terms of an awful lot, in terms of the industrial legacy, and the post-industrial legacy, and the poverty rates, and the social dysfunction, the two are extremely similar. So there's a lot of material there that I've been using. What am I doing now? I've developed new metrics to tell that story that are related to, that seamlessly link with all the conventional economic metrics and all the social metrics, but they're new. I could talk about them later if the topic comes up, but they involve neurological trauma and childhood trauma as a way of explaining why you have a unrelenting, persistent downward dynamic in these cities.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, you can Google John's name and childhood trauma, and it'll pull up some excellent stories that I think are very, very important to read, and probably have a lot of insights for other communities as well. So Dustin, you come from the local business weekly here. Well, sorry, probably not fair to call it a weekly anymore. You're publishing all the time online.
Yes.
So more like any other news outlet today.
A hellscape.
Yeah. So what about yourself? What are some of the stories you cover, and then
sure.
that you're working on now?
So, yeah,
I see that you call yourself the Swiss Army knife.
Yes.
Of Crane's business.
Yeah, I came in kind of weird. I started off covering automotive suppliers and higher education. That sort of has blended over the years into being, I call myself jokingly internally the Executive Vice President of General Assignment Reporting, because I end up covering so many things. We had formally changed my beat a year and a half ago to economics, which was really just an excuse to cover everything and anything under the sun, because anything can be called economics. But our coverage is slightly different. We're not focused on necessarily the inner workings of a daily newspaper would cover, crime, things like, we only cover that as it relates to business. But fortunately, everything relates to business. So I find myself, specifically with an automotive background, covering a lot of labor force issues, which is what makes Detroit, just similar to Milwaukee, so interesting. I mean, this is the most segregated city in the world. And 74% of the people that work within the city of Detroit are from the suburbs like me, leaving the people in the city of Detroit nowhere to go to work. They have to somehow huff it to the suburbs. We have no mass transit of unspeakable nature. So examining that and really kind of shining a light on how awful that can be has been a big part of what we do, and really, because you can't talk to a single employer in this town without them saying, we have a talent shortage, we can't find talent. At the end of the day, it's we can't find bodies. They can complain about talent all they want. Money gets talent. They can't find the bodies to fill the role. And so there's a huge disconnect. We always kind of joke that Detroit is a bastard city. It has no, sorry for the language, but it's so disjointed and unorganized. So I think we play a really kind of critical role in that, of highlighting where it's disorganized, why hasn't it been figured out, and how that's going to ultimately impact the business community and benefit the business community, which in turn will benefit jobs and equitable growth, ideally.
Great. Now, Pete, you're an interesting one in that you come from a professional planning background, and like myself, came at this through kind of a new media, blogging and online perspective. And so, you've got some great, I've been reading Pete's work for years. He just has great ways to think about Midwestern cities. So maybe talk a little bit about what you're up to.
Sure. Aaron actually was the one who provided the forum and platform for me to get going some 6 years ago. And every opportunity I can, I'll thank him and say that I'm grateful for that. But I have been writing a blog called The Cornerside Yard for about the last 6 years. And I started that because I wrote something about Detroit, which I called, I think it was the 9 reasons, planning reasons why Detroit declined, that I shared with Aaron, and he posted on his blog, The Urbanophile, and became a very popular piece on his blog, and that prompted me to start my own. Since then, on The Cornerside Yard, I've written extensively about the intersection of race and planning public policy with a focus on Midwestern industrial cities, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Louis, and to a lesser extent some of the smaller and medium-sized cities like in Akron or Toledo or Gary, cities like that. And one of the principal reasons I decided to do it is because there's so much of the urbanistic narrative that's being driven by coastal cities, New York, Boston, D.C. on one end, and L.A., I mean, less L.A., but more Seattle and San Francisco Bay Area on the other end, about the growth of the creative class, the tech boom that has sort of facilitated urban revival in their cores. And I thought there was a story to be told about Midwestern industrial cities, and that it was losing out on that broader national narrative. The only thing that many people know is that I think I saw in the New York Times just recently, there was a story called 36 Hours in Detroit that is condescending on many levels. But yeah, and that's the approach that many coastal media people have taken to writing about Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, Milwaukee, other cities. So what I wanted to do is to focus on those cities, their legacies, their futures, and to develop some ideas for coming up with a new narrative so that we can start talking about the reasons why they got that way and the road and the path forward for all of them.
Great, thanks. And then Jerome, you are the real people who work primarily with words. You're a radio guy, and you're the news director for your station. So maybe talk a little bit, about what you do, but also maybe more broadly about what your initiatives are at the station, if you feel that's relevant.
Yeah. How much time do we have? I'm at WDET. It's the NPR station here in Detroit. Let me, I guess, take that in the other way. Basically, what we're looking at as part of our station mission is Detroit, what it's going to take for Detroit to come back, what it's going to take for Detroit to survive, depending on what day it is. We go anywhere from one extreme to the other, but it's really Detroit-centric coverage about what's going on, what's it going to take for the region to come together. We really look at trying to convene conversations and dialogue between disparate groups. As Dustin was saying, the most segregated city in the country. And so we're trying to do our part to at least get people to open up and talk to each other about these issues and come to some realization of how that divide that takes place there is hurting us. Recently, there have been a lot of stories throughout all of Detroit media about Amazon not coming here and us guessing on the 800 reasons why. And so those are sorts of issues that we like to look at to talk about, issues of segregation, issues of transportation, issues of, if I fall asleep in the middle of this, it's because I was telling Dustin I was up late last night producing a live 1-hour special last night on education. That just plays a little role in what's going on here in Detroit. But those are the sorts of issues that we look at and try to convene conversations with. I'll just chime in really quickly. I'm a Detroit guy, born and bred. I'm completely biased. Detroit is my favorite place on the face of the earth. And I'm doing my part single-handedly to keep the census up. I have 8 children. And so that also motivates me. Yeah, right. That also motivates me to make sure that I'm doing my part and the station is doing its part to work towards covering Detroit well so that people can know what they need to know to make the right decisions, whether in their their daily life or in the voting booth.
Well, that's impressive on many levels. Well, I have a few topics big topics that I really wanted to cover in this panel today. One, I want to talk about narratives and the roles that media plays in shaping narratives about the communities and where they come from. I also want to talk about changes in the media landscape, because the media business has dramatically been upended and transformed by technology and business changes, and that affects a lot of local communities profoundly. And then maybe we can weave some of this in, but I want to make sure we actually do come back and talk about what we've learned from a media perspective around restoring markets, because that is the topic of our panel. So I want to talk first about narratives. Historically, the daily paper in a community had a tremendous ability to set the agenda for that community, to tell the story, had sort of a privileged position in telling the story of that community, and could, in fact, put things on the agenda of the community. Couldn't necessarily create the decisions that people might want, but could create discussion. So I think it was about 15 years ago, the Cleveland Plain Dealer did a massive series called A Quiet Crisis about that city's challenges. And today, daily papers are much diminished in the world, and people are getting their news from all sorts of sources. People are now getting it from cable news. They're getting it from social media. Many young people don't read newspapers. Where then, I guess, John, since you work for a daily paper, how does a community mobilize for discussion around important things in that community? And how does it tell the story of itself kind of in this era that we're in?
Yeah, right. Broadly gauged question. I never felt good about the thought of abdicating that role. The newspaper is privileged, and with that privilege comes responsibility, and I represent a newsroom that takes that responsibility very seriously. I can't speak for others. I've seen other newspapers throw in the towel. I've seen other newspapers come into the fiscal crisis that we're in, the well-documented decline in daily newspaper, print on paper readership falling, and what that does to our income and ad revenue. We were just joking before this started about newspapers that went into the crisis basically responding in crisis mode. And you've seen that. You just can your reporters. If they've got experience and therefore they're expensive to hire, they're gone, they're out the door. And from that, you do have a diminishment in civic debate. There's no question. We don't even have to talk about it. My newspaper, I'm happy and proud to talk about. We never abdicated our commitment to enterprise, to the community, to the stories we tell, and to finding the new narratives. We boil down our mission statement to one word, which is relevance, and out of that comes, what is the new story? What haven't we read 15 times? What is new? What is relevant? Which brings us back to cities like Milwaukee, like Detroit, like all the Midwestern cities that we're all here talking about today. And I love the theme of this conference, because that to me is very fascinating. Our executive editor goes to conferences around the country, and people come up to him and say, hey, we lost as many or more. We still have more than you do, and you win more prizes at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. You have more enterprise. What is your secret sauce? What are you doing at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel that we somehow can't manage to do? It was strategic. I can't, in the time we have, do justice to our strategy, but we didn't give up enterprise or vision or purpose. We only work on the A-list stories now. The B-list stories, the nice-to-have stories, I'm sorry, I don't have time for them anymore. So we still have a punchy front page. One thing I will add, because it's relevant, and I'm actually dying to hear what these guys have to say, is it's true that we don't have the budget. When I was hired in 2003, coming in from Germany to Milwaukee, I remember they said, we're hearing a lot about China. Could you go to China? Could you write up China? Could you tell us what's going on in China? Is it a bunch of people in rice paddy fields with bare feet? Or what's going on there? And they said, here, you have an open checkbook. That was the last time in 2003 that anyone ever said that to me. Now we work with foundations, journalistic foundations, the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. On 2 occasions, I've accepted clean money. We have to have clean money and full disclosure. Outside grants, effectively, to do in-depth research. For that, the reader knows where we got it from, can appraise for himself that it's clean money. And we are able to do the big projects just like we ever did before, without giving up ambition.
Well, that piece about the foundation funding is very interesting. We're going to come back to that because I think it's really an innovative way a lot of people are looking to fund themselves. Detroit's an interesting case when it comes to narratives because a lot of the narratives that are being told about Detroit are coming out of national or international media, probably much more than any other Midwest city, maybe with the exception of Chicago. The national and global media have fixated on Detroit. And you've had foreign documentary filmmakers come here, you've had, British newspapers, the New York Times have written many, many articles. And out of that you read a lot of different narratives. One of them was, Detroit is, basically it's going down the tubes, it's collapsing. This narrative of just sort of the ruin porn, as they called it, narrative. To say that in a broader form, it's we're going to come here and kind of gawk at the collapse. And then you've got another narrative that you hear about, essentially Detroit is back. It's the comeback city. Talk about what Dan Gilbert is doing, and you come in here and you do all this stuff. And I'm probably as guilty as anyone of writing stories about Detroit that have kind of an outside. What's it like? What's the experience as a local person dealing with all these outside stories about your city? And then as kind of the local journalists here, how do you tell a local story in the midst of all that national discussion? How do you approach that? So maybe we'll start with Jerome through that, and we'll come back to you, Dustin.
Okay. Wow. I think how do you tell that local story as a local journalist in the midst of what's going on, the national stories? I think because I think the trick is over time to build relationships with your local audience. So they know you, they know who you are, they know what you're working on, they know what you stand for. And that's really important to build those sort of connections, be it, paper, magazine, blog, radio, television. If you've got that connection, that's how you work to build the trust. Someone flying in from, let's say, the New York Times, because they have done a lot on Detroit lately, I think people take that with a grain of salt. There's only a select group of people in Detroit, Metro Detroit, who are reading the New York Times on a daily basis in the first place. But beyond that, they know that, all right, this is someone who's coming in and reporting on something in Detroit. In a lot of cases, and this is a frustration of people in my newsroom when they read something in the Times, not always, but the tone of it isn't right, or the detail isn't there because this is someone who isn't of the community or of Metro Detroit, and so there are finite details that are just missing, and that's understood. But I think that's where the difference comes in, where we as local journalists are working on things. We can talk about what's happening on such and such a corner, and people know what we're talking about. There's a whole subtone and subtext there that, you know, people in New York, when they read it, aren't going to know or care about. And so I think that that's how we deal with it.
I mean, yeah, I mean, those national narratives are overarchingly true and completely wrong. And from a local perspective, I sort of ignore it, right? Because it doesn't seem relevant to me, because it's we have our own preconceived notions of things we've read about Bangkok, right, or Kabul. You know, I mean, it's that doesn't mean anything to us. Yeah, of course you get phone calls from people from New York. Oh, Detroit's this or that, or great, or terrible, depending on their perspective. They're right. It is great. It is terrible. But it doesn't affect what we do on a day-to-day basis. I think maybe we journalistic integrity, right? We're not just like try to tell great, nice stories so the national media thinks, oh, everything's great here. We're here to affect change one way or the other, good or bad. So the narratives don't, I don't know, I don't let them impact me or kind of, and I think it's sort of a sense of pride, right? Like, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. Largely they don't, because I couldn't do the same thing. I couldn't fly to New Orleans and encapsulate a good story about New Orleans, because I've never been there. I have no idea what's going on in New Orleans. I get their desire and need to do so, but it's tourism. You know, it's tourism journalism. It's not. It doesn't impact the narrative here, I don't think.
What do you guys think the story is not being told about Detroit? What are the stories that aren't getting told that need to be told?
I think there's a lot of stories in Detroit that are being told. People just haven't heard it enough. You know, I think the inequity in Detroit, we are still a very racist region. Those things are all known, but we're not pounding it through. Detroit has a lot of opportunity to be really progressive, and I don't mean that from a liberal conservative point of view, but there's a lot of things Detroit could be doing that could really become national models. You know, we have to find a way to get the city of Detroiters to work in good paying jobs that provide some sort of modest standard of living. You know, I think those will be the long-term stories of Detroit that will have a resounding effect. And they're working on it. There are people that are working on it. People are bootstrapping. It's very Detroit-like. You know, people are working together what feels like the first time in decades. It's just a matter of, you know, we have a history of screwing that up. Let's not screw that up. And I think there's another story about the business community here. How the business community is changing, how the jobs are changing, that I don't think we're becoming a pretty high-tech city, not in a Seattle, Silicon Valley point of view, almost the antithesis of that in the right way. You know, we realize that, you know, for better or worse, we're an automotive manufacturing town. Those things are becoming electronics devices. And, you know, you see the fluffy headlines about, you know, car is a computer. But it's beyond that. There's so much things that, I mean, the city of the future is going to be designed by a lot of people that are from here. And it's because of the way we move. And that's the start of what the automobile did. So I think those stories, I don't think Detroit's role, its importance in that role, has been highlighted enough.
Do you have any thoughts there, Jerome?
I just would say, you know, I agree with Dustin that there are a lot of untold stories. What really comes to mind to me is what he was saying was, you know, Detroiters are very creative and have come up with, you know, all of these solutions to these problems that have been here for decades, and have found workarounds and ways to survive and even thrive in these unfortunate circumstances that could be models for the rest of the country, and I think that is something that's very important to tell. I think the other thing is there are just all sorts of stories about how things are broken as well. A few years back, you know, we did a series of stories about just what was available where Detroiters buy their groceries. And back then when we did the series, there wasn't a major chain in the city of Detroit. And most people were getting their groceries from what we call party stores, right? They're basically liquor stores and chips and whatnot. And to get food stamps, they had to offer certain things to people, right? Certain levels of healthy food. And we went into all of these stores and found out that many of them didn't have these healthy things. You might go into a store that was certified to take food stamps, and all they had was one apple on the counter. So those are stories as well that need to be told.
So, Pete, we talked a little bit about the national narrative specific to Detroit, and it's really uniquely, I think, labored under that. You're from Detroit. You grew up in the city of Detroit, so you probably know something about that. But there's another class of national narrative that is affecting other cities pervasively, and that is narratives like gentrification. And that essentially all of the writing about cities and urban policy concerns and what issues should be at the top of mind in terms of cities, it seems to me a lot of them are coming out of the coasts. And that's why it's dominated by housing shortage issues and displacement issues and other things. Do those narratives apply in these Midwest cities? And if so, in what way, and if not?
Well, I think that's a great question. One of the things that I've kind of noted, and first of all, let me start by saying that I kind of come into this as maybe the representative of the so-called new media, as someone who never thought I was in a traditional media like my other colleagues here. So I kind of started what I'm doing sort of in response to some of the broader narratives that come from the coast, kind of like gentrification and displacement concerns and housing shortages. What I've found is that, again, I'm originally from Detroit. I live in Chicago. And I think that there's a desire for many Midwestern industrial cities to kind of be a part of that broader conversation, to say, yeah, we have housing problems just like Brooklyn does, when that's not necessarily the case. There are totally different challenges in many of the cities that are here. I think maybe in a zip code or two, you may find some of those same challenges as you do on the east or west coast. And I think Chicago, I think, is probably the most guilty of the Midwestern cities for trying to put itself in the same plane as what's happening in New York, DC, Seattle, Silicon Valley, Bay Area. And saying, yeah, we have those same high prices, we have those same challenges, when we also still have the same challenges that Detroit and Milwaukee and other cities have on the west and south sides of the city. So I think that we have a great role to play in trying to bring out those differences and those challenges. And I think that the media, whether old or new or traditional or non-traditional, non-conventional, media has a role in telling the story of what's happening in this region and how it's distinct, I think, from what's happening on the coasts.
Yeah, I definitely see that myself. I mean, every city has got like a cadre of anti-gentrification advocates, and they're very commonly quoted in national kind of publications like the Atlantic City Lab or that, and it's very easy, I see, for that to come to. Does anybody else have a thought on the gentrification narrative as something that applies or doesn't apply in your community?
It's misplaced usually. Mm-hmm. Economic diversity within small regions within the city of Detroit is incredibly critical for the success of the city. I think we have the hipster contingent that complain about gentrification because their first edition bookstore can't survive. Mm-hmm. Those things, I think, are overblown. They're not really relative to the overall narrative necessarily here in Detroit. I mean, obviously, public housing is an issue. I mean, there's certain priorities that would fall under the idea of gentrification. We have a lot of space. There's no reason that it should be that way. It's just we need to figure out how to diversify economically in our neighborhoods. which is sort of falls in line with that idea of gentrification. But at the same time, we need investment badly here. So there's a balance, but I think it's largely overblown. It's not the coast. It's not Brooklyn. It's not Red Hook or whatever issues they're facing. So I don't think, largely you're not going to see as negative of approach to gentrification here, although certainly there are elements of people that do complain. So I don't know. It's not. To me, it's not as important as maybe you see on the coast.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if gentrification is one of the words that's going to get mothballed in this debate. I'm listening to you guys. I really like what Dustin just said. There is an economic process. There is an economic diversification, which is a nice way of saying that these neighborhoods are in flux. They are in transition. They do have potential.
Sure.
And it's not a black-white poverty versus gentrification thing. The neighborhoods that I'm watching in Milwaukee, the ones that have the most innovative strategies are blending. Comeback in a Milwaukee neighborhood doesn't look like gentrification.
Right.
And I want to say thank you to the guys who are, well, singing on the same choir sheet, I think, here. There's a coastal narrative on the economy in the United States, especially when you look at the urban economy. There are the tech hubs, there are the financial centers, the bank hubs, and so on. The Midwest urban economy is worth studying unto itself. And I think it's really cool to hear these debates. I think gentrification is probably going to have a longer lasting echo on the East and West Coasts than it will here because of the way that neighborhoods are turning around in what had been, let's face it, the legacy of these cities that we're all talking about was in the 1970s, in the pre-global world, these were the economies that rode high. Full productivity, full employment, making things. Innovation meant making a better motor, a better blender. I think I'm going to just feel compelled to add just a recommendation for probably one of the best books I've seen on this, which is by a Chicago writer and thinker named Richard Longworth. It's called Caught in the Middle, and he dissects all the issues. He says that the Midwest economy is different from all the other economies. Here's why. He looks at immigration. He looks at economic change, a broad gamut of issues, and more than we could ever discuss in this one panel.
Well, you bring up something very interesting, which is the idea of a Midwest economy. And I know we have these national narratives around urban areas, and even about cities in the Midwest. We've sort of got the local narrative. The one thing that I've seen a lot less of is called the regional narrative. And the only reason I'm sitting on this panel, I was a partner at the consulting firm of Accenture, and I was very frustrated at what I saw being written about cities. So I started writing a blog called the Urbanophile. I published it under a pseudonym, and originally I intended it to essentially be an Indianapolis-focused blog. But I got very frustrated quickly because I would listen to people there talk about their city and realize they did not know what was happening just 100 miles down the road in Cincinnati or in Louisville, Kentucky, or in St. Louis. So I decided to make it a Midwest regional blog instead, and just to kind of almost, call it competitive intelligence or whatever. I wanted to kind of like get a sense of what was going on. And I think that was key to it kind of becoming a very, very widely read site. And Pete, you did something very, very similar in your site, in that you didn't just write about Detroit or Chicago. You are an analyst of all of these Midwest post-industrial cities. What are the regional narratives that maybe aren't getting told? Narratives or just frameworks for understanding that maybe these cities aren't learning from each other, or there's no context. Is that a thing that you see? I think that's a big problem. Yeah,
I have written basically about all of the cities from Buffalo and Pittsburgh to the east to St. Louis and Minneapolis to the west. Really centered in Detroit and in Chicago. I've also written about the regional narrative, and one of the things that I think that local media over the course, let me put this in some context first of all. I grew up, like I said, in Detroit. When I was a young child, we lived not very far from 12th and Claremont. My parents were students at Wayne State University, and my absolute first memory, honest to goodness, is of the 67 riots. I remember seeing tanks and cars and fires, and the absolute first memory that I had at age 2.5. And honestly, I've always wanted to see cities improve, and wondered why people were leaving the city and why people were talking down about Detroit, and that expanded to other Midwestern industrial cities. That being said, I saw similar narratives playing out in other cities throughout this region. The sense of loss, the sense of economic loss, the sense of neighborhood loss, community loss, and that became something that dominated, I think, in many cities from Buffalo all the way to St. Louis. And I think that that's been something that's kind of permeated through probably less the newspaper media and more in local TV media when they're talking about the fires or the murders or the carjackings or all of those different things. And it promotes a sense of anarchy. And that has been something that I think has really impacted residents of all of those cities. I think, I do what I do because I've done that in response to all of that. Also, I think there's if there is a future for us, I think that it's dealing with the sense of stigmatization and ostracization, if that's a word, that each of these cities has felt. That the economic loss is supported by that stigmatization that's happened for all of these cities. And I think that once these cities confront that, deal with it, and deal with the impacts of it, you'll start to see the narrative begin to change and see hopefully better outcomes for all the residents in the cities themselves.
So I want to ask a little bit about what the role of the media should be in narratives, because a lot of the economy runs on essentially expectations about the future. Cities are hot, Nashville's hot. Why is Nashville hot? Well, in part Nashville's hot because the New York Times said it was hot. And why do people want to move to some of these places? It's because there's been a lot of media that has helped to build it up. That doesn't mean there's no reality there. Sort of the media, the PR, the marketing has been a big part of that. In the 1970s, there was a sociology theory about the governance of cities called the growth machine. And it was the idea that local elites, land-based elites, really came together in order to promote economic growth to essentially increase the value of real estate. And one of the components of the growth machine in this model was the newspaper. And so I'm curious, do you see essentially a booster function for your city as part of the job of a media person? Or do you think it's not your job? Or what is the right stance of media towards essentially being essentially telling your city's story or neighborhood story from a marketing perspective?
Yeah. I bristle at the word boosterism as anyone would who's in my trade. We're in a sports town. No question about that. In my newspaper, our sports section will have a smacks of boosterism because we are pro-Packers, we are pro-boosters. When the Brewers play the Cubs, you know where we are taking our position. But that's where it ends. The preferred term, the word that keeps coming to mind when I'm listening to you guys is cliches. the New York Times will come in and recycle the Detroit cliche. There's a Milwaukee cliche that persists. It's the worst city in North America for African Americans. I don't want to dwell on it too much. I know where it comes from. I know I've crunched more data on these things than most people I meet. So I wouldn't call so I wouldn't call our role boosterism, but I would call our role anything that strips away the cliche and gets to the fundamental narratives. I see a lot of universalism. I see a lot of opportunities for universalism. You could go black, white, Hispanic, or Martian. There's a lot of stories. There's a lot of stories that I've been writing where there's incredibly uncanny commonality between white, rural, hillbilly, elegy, Wisconsin, farmland, timberland, Northwoods, and rural minority, no, an urban minority, Milwaukee, Kenosha, Racine, Wisconsin. The issues, when you boil them down to clean data analysis, are nearly identical. It's phenomenal how there's a red-blue partisan divide in a universal commonality there.
Gentlemen, have any thoughts?
I'll chime in, and I'll just say, I know about that boosterism. After I got out of college, a friend of mine and I got called to the shining city on the hill, in Reagan's words, and for us then it was San Francisco, and that was the city at that time that everyone was talking about, and it was great, and you could go there and there was gold lying in the street and you just have to pick it up and put it in your pocket. And no one told me the gold was lying there because an earthquake had shaken it loose. But there is that sort of role that you could see, and you can see, I think, in many media. I think for us, it's really about getting to the truth of the matter, telling about what's going on in town, what's going wrong so it can be fixed without, covering it up or making it look glossier than it is, but to say, hey, education is a problem in Detroit. We need to fix this if we want to be a healthy town, a successful town. That's something that needs to be taken care of. If we want our businesses to succeed so that we can have jobs, we have to make sure the education is together so that there are people that can be hired for these jobs, whatever these jobs are going to be. So I think that's sort of the extent of the pro-Detroit, the boosterism, is to tell the truth. And on this, I'd say, these great things, these innovative things are going on, and these are things you need to know about, again, like I was saying earlier, so that you as a resident of Detroit, Metro Detroit, Michigan, can make a good decision about where you want to work, where you want to put your kids in school, who you want to vote for in November. Those are, that's kind of what we are, pushing to do. And I guess the last thing I'd say is no pack, go Lions.
I'll broaden that slightly. Yes, ultimately my function as a reporter is we hold people accountable. That is our job. Our job is to hold those accountable and to highlight stories and truth and all the things you read on carved into the side of journalism buildings, newspapers and stuff. But the other day, we're a media company. There are things that we do that I would consider boosterism. Like, for instance, our company has an event every year we call Detroit Homecoming. We bring in the wealthiest, most famous people we can find, and we fly them into Detroit, and we put on 3 days of programming to try to get them to essentially come up with a plan and invest into Detroit. My company does that. That is absolute boosterism. There's no other way to I have nothing to do with that because I'm independent from that side of the operation. So I think there is a lot of boosters on that becomes, because at the end of the day, a better, bigger, more profitable city is better, bigger, and more profitable for us. So there is that as far as the overall media company. Within, I sort of view what I do, same thing, very hold everyone accountable, this and that, but we do have a concept of punching up, kissing down, right? I think that's just common behavior in journalism. Yeah, I won't go any further, but yes, I mean that's there is boosters, I think, overall. Just
yeah. Let me chime in on that and kind of go back to the regional narrative piece. I think these gentlemen have all represented their cities well, but I do think that there's value in the regional narrative approach, and I don't think it necessarily comes naturally to the people who've been working in Milwaukee or Detroit in those media outlets. But I do think that linking the issues and challenges that face a Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, Indianapolis, St. Louis, and even the smaller cities, can help counter that broader narrative, and in essence helps you to tell the story about the good things that are happening in your cities, and developing an idea for a rationale for why things got the way that they are. It's the most effective balance I can think of the Times coming in and saying we're spending 36 hours in Detroit and not have the right context. We have to be able to develop a context for what's happening in this region of the country.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that Richard Longworth had talked about in his book was calling for a Midwest newspaper, which doesn't seem very likely at this point, given kind of the realities of the media business. I have one other kind of like, when I start, just use an example. I'm going to get your take on what you think, how you think the media should be approaching it, and what the obligation is with regards to telling stories, particularly in these areas where there's been challenges with investment, marketplace investment. In Chicago, there's been a long time push to get the University of Chicago Hospital to open a level 1 trauma center on the south side of Chicago, which they just did. And the Chicago Tribune wrote an article about that. And new trauma center opens on south side of Chicago, and one of their little things in the subheading was something about serving a violence-racked neighborhood. And many people on Twitter were taking umbrage at the phrase violence-racked, and were saying you should say resource-deprived or whatever. So I think it's accurate to say that there is violence in these areas. But I think it's also fair that people would say, well, that's the only story you ever tell about the south side of Chicago is violence. So when you think about a situation like that and trying to put that into context, how do you think as a media company you navigate telling stories about something like that trauma center in a neighborhood like that? How do you approach it in terms of getting the nuance right, and what the obligation of the media is in telling those stories?
First thing the reporter would say, I didn't write the headline. Right. Because they wouldn't have written that headline. I mean, at the end of the day, is the trauma center going to do, I don't know enough questions. Like, is the trauma center going to deal with nothing but gunshots? Well, then that's an accurate phrase, and your complaint about it is bullshit. But yeah, there's always a balance. I think what you do is you talk as a newsroom. You talk. There are going to be people that are smarter than me in certain areas. You keep those conversations going. You want to, and you meet with as many people as you possibly can. Have meetings with people that influencers in the city, people that understand, so you don't make those mistakes, right? Those mistakes come from being disconnected and not understanding what's happening in a community. The person that wrote that headline probably doesn't visit Southside Chicago, or doesn't, you know what I mean? Like, if assuming the headline was wrong. So I think it's having that conversation. Even in our own newsroom, someone will stop you from doing something really stupid every day, and that's what a good newsroom is supposed to do. If that makes sense.
Pete, you have thoughts on that? You're a Chicago guy now.
Yeah, honestly, that whole I have some knowledge about that situation. Back in the early 90s, the last trauma center at Providence Hospital, which is just north of University of Chicago Hospital, had closed. And I was working on a neighborhood plan for the city of Chicago at that time. And there were a lot of complaints from residents who were talking about that. And the city went the next 20, 25 years with no major trauma center on the south side of the city. And there was a very infamous case of a young man who was shot and placed at University of Chicago. I think some gang members drove up, dropped him off, and said he's going to get help here. And the university said, we don't do that here. You'll have to send him to Northwestern. And he later died. And that prompted a lot of protests about that. That being said, Dustin is right that a lot of this is because of the disconnect between people who are in the newsroom, who are working on stories like this. And I take it back to the ostracization and the lack of connection between people in that community and in the places where stories like that are written. So, I have, like I said, some personal knowledge of that, but also see how it could happen in that way. And people are, at the grassroots level, are constantly working to fight that narrative.
So just, John, you've been reporting on economic transition since 2003. So as I said at the beginning, I'd like to get a sense from you, what are some of the takeaways that you have in looking at all these, essentially neighborhood and urban revitalization efforts, trying to restore tools towards market restoration? What have you seen? What lessons learned might you be able to take away to share with people here from all of your reporting in Milwaukee over the last 15 years?
I'm going to seg right off of this discussion. The narrative that you talked about and they're reacting to is a trauma center to treat people rushed in by ambulance with bullet holes in their body. And there's enough of them that you need a trauma center. And in fact, apparently, it was overdue. Am I right? So I have some questions. Different questions, maybe. I've been asking, yeah. What happens in an urban society where you're routinely coming home and there's an ambulance in front of your house? You're coming home from school and there's an ambulance in front of your house because someone was shot and rushed to the trauma center in your house. Or you might have been at school and on the playground there was a guy brandishing a gun and pointing it at you. Do you think those kids are going to grow up and go to Harvard? I think that there is a new narrative that I'm beginning to see, and I began this project that you referred to. Thank you for mentioning it. It's a multi-part, multimedia series. It's called A Time to Heal. It's the nicest title that we could come up with. It came from the book of Ecclesiastes because we needed a nice title that had the word heal in it because everything in the story was extremely dark. It started as an economic story precisely on these issues. And the economic question was, why are cities like Chicago, like Detroit, like Milwaukee, like Cleveland, and I could go down a big catalog, caught in a downward dynamic spiral that doesn't stop? You've had wars on poverty, you've had urban empowerment zones, you've had tech booms, you've had national upswings, and these economies are impervious. They continue to decline. Poverty continues to spread. We mapped it online with motion graphics using census tract mapping going back to 1970. That was our basic starting point. It defies the law, the idea of urban planners for the past 50 years. So we went into the neighborhoods, and what I expected to hear was jobs. We need more jobs. We need more jobs. The social workers who were on the front lines were not talking that way. Something had changed in the last 5 to 10 years since I had last done the deep dive that we were talking about. Now they were talking about trauma, neurological trauma. It's invisible. It's as invisible as it is for the Vietnam vet or the Iraq war vet who lost it. Well, if you lose your leg due to a landmine, then it's not invisible. If you are with the man and you came home and you saw him maimed, it is invisible. The weird thing is, now that there are metrics, which we gathered, that show the extent and breadth of civilian neurological trauma in American society, in my mind, it changes the debate, and to your question, it changes the narrative. These are lifelong scars, and they will have effects on how you grow up as an adult in terms of your employability, in terms of your mental health, your behavioral health, and your physical health. They're tightly correlated. No one disputes the numbers. It's just that the numbers are so new that it's, as an opportunity journalistically, it's one that we had to seize. This was a whole new way of looking at it. We need more police. We need more teachers, we need more schools, we need more housing. Some say we need more prisons to break the cycle. That's fine. No one disputes the importance of those jobs or the dignity of work, but they were not answering the fundamental questions. I'll just leave you with one data point, and that was the starting point for these articles, to explain why there's a generational echo that keeps going, keeps perpetuating unrelentingly. In the one city we haven't discussed, Atlanta, Emory University researchers working with local hospitals modeled how many residents of inner city Atlanta would be appropriately diagnosed with PTSD. The answer was 46%. That's nearly half. Do you think that doesn't have an impact? The symptoms may have come from a war zone, they may have come from DuSable High School. As an adult, the alcoholism, the unemployability, the cold sweats, the screaming in your sleep, the outcomes are the same. It's neurological. So that's what I am continuing to write about. That's what I have been writing about. These stories are easy to find. I would love feedback on them. But so that, I'm happy to have a new narrative and a relative narrative, and since that's what we're talking about, that's my answer to your question.
Now, you want to go to questions? Is that what I say? I would like to let these guys, like, maybe briefly give the...
Yeah, let them answer.
And then,
I know there are questions that are recently.
Okay, good.
Up, so let's
yeah.
finish out your thoughts.
Yeah, so maybe just, yeah, if you guys briefly had any, you've written a million stories, I mean, on a lot of topics. Mm-hmm. Just a quick... the points that you see, the relevance around restoring markets in some of these areas that you think is most relevant to people?
I think it's developing a plan and sticking with the plan if we're talking about restoring markets, mm-hmm. something Detroit has never done. We've mm-hmm. abandoned every single plan we've ever come up with. Mm-hmm. We've never allowed it to flourish, to blossom, to turn into what it's supposed to. Whether that be changing administrations, whether that be economic downturns, whether that be whatever competing schools of thought, competing personalities. We've never allowed something to work in this city. And I think it's common in a lot of cities. Everyone's got big ideas, everyone's really smart, but no one ever follows through. And I think that when we talk about market restoration, that's what I think.
I'm going to say that the story that needs to be told is overcoming the legacy of segregation, that much of the neurological trauma that you're talking about is a legacy of segregation, and that I think...
Yeah.
Okay. You're good.
I think that despite what Richard Rothstein said when I asked him, I said, do you think that segregation has been sort of perfected in Midwest industrial cities? He says, no, it's happened everywhere. I tend to disagree and think that it was something that was perfected in this region of the country from Buffalo to St. Louis. And I don't mean obviously perfected in a good way. It's a legacy that has an impact on our on neurological processes. It has an impact on our economy. And one of the things that I believe strongly is that these economies have been moving forward with one arm behind their back because they're not inclusive. So I think that that's a narrative that really needs to be really developed more and really brought more to the forefront.
Jerome?
I would just say what everyone else just said. I mean, how can you follow John after where he's just been? I would say you know, having the community, the neighborhoods involved in the discussions and about finding solutions. So often solutions are imposed, and I'm not saying, you know, every single person needs to have a say in what every single answer is going to be, but to really have those that community input when solutions are being found. And, you know, I'll just say it one more time, you know, to have the, you know, have education in the mix as well.
Okay, great. I think we're now going to turn it to some questions, and I will let our microphone people determine who gets to go.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel. It's great. So I have a number of questions, but I guess I'll answer the one that's, oh, sorry. I'm Alicia Kitsusi. I'm the director of the Older Industrial Cities working group at the Funders Network. So I sort of represent the philanthropic sector. So I'll ask the philanthropic question of you. There are, of course, a number of funders that are active in funding media, and certainly a number of funders that are within my group that are interested in that topic as well. How do you see philanthropy playing a role in getting out the vital stories that aren't being told? And how do you see that as something that can be made sustainable, I suppose, which is always one of the top considerations as funders move in with a new project?
I mean, I can't speak to, you know, we don't have any foundations funding us, but we do have Bridge Michigan. Bridge is a publication here in Michigan that is completely funded through the nonprofit foundation sector. And they do absolute amazing work. But the big thing with that is, you give us money, you do not dictate a single thing that we can accomplish.
Amen.
Right.
Yep.
So I think there's it depends whether there's enough nonprofits out there comfortable with that. I do believe it's probably a pretty good model for the future for journalism, particularly at the community level, or even the policy level is another good place. Eliminating that, you have to balance a budget, obviously, but eliminating that need to sell a bunch of ads or do, you know, to really do these things is sort of a really good place for journalism. I hope more foundations invest in that, but there has to be that line of complete autonomy.
I'll just chime in. That is my life. I work for public radio. You know, our listeners give us about 50% of our, you know, operating budget. We've got underwriters, businesses who support us, and foundations who support us as well. But like Dustin said, you don't get to tell me what I'm going to write about or talk about. Good luck trying.
Hi, I'm Greg Leroy from Good Jobs First. I work with journalists every day, pushing them to improve the coverage of economic development incentive issues like what I was talking about yesterday. And I have this very complicated sense of your work in this space. And part of me wants to say only business writers and investigative reporters should get to write about things like Amazon HQ2 sweepstakes, not political writers, for example, because I see so much bad writing coming from the political desks on this issue. You know, we have distortions, and what I want you to do better is make sure the public understands how companies succeed, how companies grow, how jobs get created, what really matters to companies, which is almost never economic development incentives, right? It's about markets and synergy and clusters and innovation and public goods that support collectively groups of companies, but not big one-off buffalo hunt, you know, pots of gold, like the HQ2 episode. And when I hear the stories here about like food deserts, like where's the incentive money? You've got gazillions of dollars for Quicken Loans, but what about all the food deserts in the city, for example? What's that about? I would urge you to insert yourself into the editorial tables about, and try to think more on day-to-day coverage about which companies are succeeding and why, and help people have a better understanding of, because I send people to the beige book. You were at the Fed, I say, it's not about incentives, it's about the broader forces of the state and regional economy. Read the beige book if you want to understand how Detroit's doing this month versus 2 years ago.
Reactions?
Yeah, I don't know to respond to that as the business reporter. Yes. I think our publication, particularly my role, I get to do a little more analysis and columnizing. I was pretty anti-tax incentives for Amazon and other large ones. From a personal perspective, I don't believe it works. So yeah, but I understand what you're saying.
Hi, my name is April Feng. I'm from the city of South Bend. Prior to my experience in public policy, I worked in CBS News in Washington, D.C. And so when people talk to me, I remember the most frequent thing that I hear at that time is, journalists, you tell the truth, you tell the story. That's really annoying to me because there are so many of truths that you want to tell. And so personally, I'm very curious to each one of you, what is the most difficult choice you made between 2, 3, or many, many truths?
Let me just start about that because, when I was thinking about what to say about that and saying, part of our job is telling the truth, I thought about, yeah, someone's going to get up and say there are many sides to the truth. So thank you, and that's exactly right. I mean, I think part of that is, telling a story from, different perspectives, talking to a number of people in a community, in a business sector, about a story that you're working on, so that you're not just coming at it from one perspective. And I think, at least in my mind, coming to it to know that, yeah, you're never going to get to the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. But my job is to get as close as I can, to get as much of that out, as many of the facts out, and bring them to the table as I can, given finite time, finite resources, and definitely finite IQ.
I'm going to just dovetail on that. Any reader or viewer or listener is going to quickly discern if the reporter, in the time he had, under the deadlines he was working, made an effort to make the story as complete as reasonably expected possible, and would appreciate the fact that there was clearly an effort for that news consumer to learn. The same bullshit detector works both ways. The biggest problem, I think, in the decline in the credibility of news organizations is the obverse, which is lazy journalism. What goes with lazy journalism, without the fact-checking, without those efforts, without at least a modicum of those efforts, is, and I see this on cable news all the time, is what do you insert when you didn't do the reporting? You insert your own ideology and dogma and your political views. Perhaps those happen to fit the cable channel's prevailing news ethos. So lazy journalism quickly becomes ideological journalism. Then with ideological journalism, you get this partisanship, this strange, intensifying social phenomenon that I see all the time of talking heads who haven't done the reporting, but they are recycling some idea, usually all but overtly taking a position on some issue or other, possibly even deliberately stirring the pot. And with that, unfortunately, my trade, which is an honorable one, gets tarred and feathered by extension, and then you lose credibility for the industry as a whole.
I mean, I think with journalism, I mean, let's bring this way down to the base, is you kind of know. You know when you've screwed up a story because you can't write it. The old journalism 101 is if you're struggling to write the story, you haven't interviewed enough people. And I think that's where it comes in. That's where the lazy journalism comes in, is that you haven't talked to enough people to find, and again, we use the word truth so freely. There's very little of it. There are things that are true, and there's viewpoints. John deals in data. He knows very well. He can make that data say whatever he wants.
Yeah. Lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Right. So, I operate under 3 truths. Everyone talks, everything's negotiable, and never trust yourself. And I think those are the things that I try to do in journalism is I need to talk to somebody else because the way I'm seeing is not good enough. And that's kind of how we try to balance each other out with other humans, other personalities.
Thank you for this very nuanced conversation. It's been great. I should say I subscribe to the Crain's and the local newspapers, and I read them regularly. I try to listen as much as possible to WDET.
Thank you.
I get the paper New York Times, but that sits on my coffee table and doesn't get read as much. So I should say I'm all for mothballing the word gentrification, but let me give you a narrative. In a conference like this, someone brings up problems related to gentrification in the city, and I'm not naming names and not pointing to anyone in this crowd, but the speaker then scolds the person in the audience who raises this question, saying investment is good, people are good, and so on. But what I want us to hear when we hear gentrification in the city of Detroit is that it's a shorthand for lots of concerns that don't get time to be played out in a question from the audience. So, for example, the questions relate to, there was a question yesterday, and I'm naming names here. But so the question was about how land bank decisions get made, and why isn't land moving to neighbors for purposes that they think are important for open space uses, for blue-green uses, et cetera, that they might decide. So it's not just a question of the fact that outsiders with wealth and different colors are coming in, but it's displacement, it's the loss of affordable housing, it's loss of home ownership, it's water shutoffs, it's evictions, and all that. So when you confront the land bank and you ask about, why is not land moving faster to these other purposes, you get responses like, well, we're waiting for the master plan to be done, or, there are these areas designated planning zones and so on, and we want to, we've held them aside. So I would like, for example, here's one question that I would like more coverage on, and that is, let's talk about land. Let's talk about, for example, the big news was the city charter change, and now that we have elections by district, what has changed? How has life in the neighborhoods improved, and so on? So that's one question. The other question, I know you. Very quickly, Detroit's problems are the region's problems, right? So I was really appreciative of Crain's covering transit and local businesses and so on. But regional transit, roads, these are very hot button issues. Sprawl, the fact that we are sprawling in terms of development without population growth, revenue sharing, schools are all regional questions. So we want the newspaper to set the agenda for decisions. So let's talk about home rule. Let's talk about the state's leadership role in these questions, because that's what people want to see. So I would like for the newspapers, with all of the rationales and goals you've set for yourselves, to also take on the role of the agenda setter for the questions that people are caring about that I talk to on a regular basis. Sorry. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. If I could just chime in real quick and say, one of the things that I know that many of us are working towards is this idea of improved engagement, of having a two-way conversation between the media organization and the community, the listeners, the readers. And that's something that we're really working towards, this idea of us sort of talking down to the communities works less and less. And so I'll just throw out, we did a survey, we're doing this series of stories, and the 4 things we got back a couple months ago that at least the people we sent out surveys to were education, transportation and infrastructure, water quality, and gerrymandering. Those were the 4 that came back to us as the big things, and so that's what we're going to be looking at over the next few months.
And there's a balance too. You know, we do as much reader engagement as we can. We want to cover the things you want to be covered, but also there's things you don't even know exist. There are things that are interesting to me or that I know about that you don't know about. So that's, you know, that's part of my role too. So yeah, we're trying, I promise.
So I think we have one more question.
Yes, sir, on the left.
My name is Dwayne Lewis. I'm chair of Vital Investment Serving in Our Neighborhoods and former chair of the Arts and Communications Lawyers for the State Bar. To what extent has a hyper-concentration of media ownership, broadcast, traditional print, and new media hampered your collective ability or the genre's ability to decloud some of the issues that you've discussed today, whether it be civilian neuropathy, whether it be, and I agree with the comment in terms of racism and its legacy and the other points that you mentioned today.
John, I don't know what your ownership structure is.
Oh, yeah, to your question about the concentration of ownership of media properties, I guess I feel comfortable talking about that because my newspaper, when I was hired, was independent, an independent media company. It changed ownership twice, and now we belong to the chain of Gannett newspapers. We're part of a national chain. We're part of the concentration. To us, that's been a blessing. Many people don't see Gannett as a blessing. It brought in new money, new innovation, new resources. But it's only one part of a bigger change in the industry. With the strength of this panel, actually, is that there's a lot of representation of bloggers, online, broadcast, and print. The diversity of the way that opinions and information is reaching anyone in this room, anyone who's got a cell phone, is going to be, or Facebook. Let's not go there. Fakebook. Has never been more, shown a greater proliferation in human history, and it's just growing. So now we're just competing. We're back to relevance. We see a story, we're going to use our megaphone to hit that story with integrity and honesty and all the principles that my colleagues here are all on the same wavelength on. But we're just joining a much louder, much broader chorus and hope we get heard and hope that there's enough civility left in American society that those stories do get passed around and discussed.
You know, one thing I would add to that, less on concentration, but the internet has enabled the nationalization of many things that were once local. You know, when I lived in Chicago, on the north side of Chicago, I just remember how few Chicago Tribunes you would see in the front of people's yards. You're much more likely to see a Wall Street Journal or a New York Times. And today, the New York Times is essentially a national newspaper. It used to be, you know, 15 years ago, if you wanted the New York Times, you had to have like a mail subscription. You couldn't get it. So I think, in a sense, the educated elite of America now consumes a large amount of national media and is taking a lot of their cues from national media in a way that they were not previously in the internet era. And that I think, causes some disconnects with the local environment because, especially in light of the challenges financially of local papers.
Yeah, we're family owned. Hopefully we'll always be family owned. There's been challenges with consolidation, I think, especially with private equity in certain cases. You've seen what's happening at the Denver Post, what happened out in Las Vegas. It can be a real problem, but that's ownership of any company. The newspapers that have taken on ownership and have had problems have done a really good job reporting on themselves, reporting on who their ownership is and why that's a problem. And hopefully that rallies people to save that newspaper. So yeah, I think we're all concerned, but we're doing the best we can.
Very quickly, I'll just add, I'm independent contractor who found my way from writing a personal blog to working for Forbes. So, I am that representative again of the new media. I get to, I think I work with some flexibility in terms of what I cover and trying to explore my sense of the truths. But, I am probably not the person who is going to have to deal with instance. Well, I'm the trying to search for the right word here. I'm the outcome of some of the things that have happened to traditional media. I am in that role in the new media on the internet because of the collapse of traditional media. That it's opened these different outlets. So I have to look to these guys to try to figure out the right way to explore those things. If I'm going to, I'm really still trying to wrap my brain around the idea of me being a part of the media, but I guess that is the truth.
All right. Jerome, unless you have anything to add, you're a nonprofit entity there. So.
I was going to say, we are licensed by a university. We are funded, half funded by the public, and so that's who we try to stay accountable to. And as far as the new media, it's a new world, and I've had to learn how to find the Google on my typewriter.
Well, great. Thank you all. I appreciate you coming in.